I want to start with a pop quiz, with a challenge for you. So let's throw the slides up. I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to tell me what year it's from. And I need precision. Guess, within the decade. Just call them out. 86, 50, 1950, 74, 2015. Exactly, right? So I give this speech around the world, and when I throw this slide up and I ask what year it's from, I get numbers ranging from 1800 to 2017. And that's a signal for us, right? That we can look at something so important and it hasn't changed. If I showed you a house, a shoe, a car, a dress, anything from 1920 and said, how old is this? You'd say, that's old. But I show you the main visual instrument by which we illustrate how we come together as people to collaborate and do our most important work. And we can't even guess within the century. So something's up. And what's happened is that basically we've allowed a way of working to persist far beyond when it should have, right? So now we live in a world where work is bosses that we don't really care for, that don't care for us, that are not resonating, planning cycles that go on longer than the cycles they're planning for. So we just start planning for the year all over again as soon as we're done with the planning process. Inboxes, whether that be in email or whether that be in Slack, that just continue to crush us with overwhelming amounts of information and messaging. Calendars that are ridiculously overbooked, sometimes double and triple booked. There's no time for thinking or reflection. And it's basically resulted in this world where engagement is at an incredibly consistent low. I don't even want to say it's an all-time low because it just stays low. And we've all seen the engagement data thrown around over the last decade more and more and more. And so when I go around and talk to companies and I say, let's go meet with the leaders and find out what's going on, sit with the leaders and say, hey, what's wrong? And they say, oh, it's the people. The people are too millennial, not millennial enough, too digital, not digital enough. They are not doing what we tell them to do. They're unfocused. They're not working hard enough. Whatever the case may be, there's a people problem here, and we have a culture problem we have to fix. And then when I go and meet with the team at the edge, the frontline employees, the people that are actually doing the work at the edge, and say, hey, what's wrong? They say, it's the leaders. The leaders are what's wrong. They're not aligned. They don't share their vision properly. They don't inspire us. They don't trust us. They don't empower us. And so it's a little bit of, finger pointing. And what we find when we actually go in bed with companies that have transformed, that have, found a different form of liberation, of freedom, of adaptivity, of speed, of growth, they've actually realized that it's not about that. Sure, it's about behavior at the end of the day. It's about how we show up and collaborate. But the problem isn't that we're innately the wrong people. The problem is the operating system. Another way I like to say it is it's not the fish, it's the aquarium, right? The operating system is something that exists in every company on the planet, just like it does in every phone, right? So everyone has a phone in their pocket that has an operating system on it. It's the simple rules, the basic foundational architecture upon which everything else stands. It's the practices, the principles, the values, the behaviors, the mindsets, all that stuff that spins up and emerges out into culture, into a way of working, a way of organizing. So how did we get at this operating system idea? So here's an example, right? What is an operating system? What does it look like in action? It can be something very simple. So here's an operating system. This is a murmuration of starlings flapping their wings, moving around. And the idea here is there are only three simple rules that emerge into this behavior. There's avoidance, alignment, and attraction. 3 rules, that's it. Avoidance says don't bump into anybody else, which is a good rule for work as well. Alignment says go in the general direction of the birds that are around you, so kind of go where everyone else is going a little bit. And then attraction says generally stay equidistant from the birds around you. And with those 3 simple rules, the operating system of this murmuration is formed, and they're able to do these elaborate patterns. They're able to move as one. They're able to respond and adapt to the environment around them. And that's just one example. There are so many in the world that are not just organizational. So we heard earlier today from Bjarte, and this was his example of 2 operating systems in the wild. On the left, you have the intersection with the traffic lights that's controlling everything and is informational and digital, and the rules are clear, and we don't trust anyone to make any decisions. And on the other side, in the roundabout, we have a freely flowing system that's fully empowered, where with a few simple rules, a few value-based agreements that we will give certain people the right of way, that will generally avoid hitting each other, we're able to create a system that is dramatically more effective. So it's more efficient in terms of traffic flow. It's safer. It's actually close to 90% safer in terms of fatality collisions. It's cheaper. It's about $10,000 to $15,000 or euro cheaper to maintain over the course of a year. And of course, it's much better when the power goes out. So in terms of resilience, you have a lot of strength in a roundabout. And so again, this idea of an operating system, of an underlying set of assumptions about how a system should work and how we should trust people, comes to bear. Now, we wanted to go out and find out what the operating system for the future might look like. And so what we did is actually talk to and study and read about and have conversations with all these companies out there that are known for being a little different, that are known for their speed or for their empowerment or for their adaptivity or their long-term success or their resiliency. And we just went and spoke. This is a sliver of the data set that ultimately ended up in this board. But we just had a question. It was basically, what's different about you? So how do you do things differently? And you get answers ranging from, we meet differently, we share information differently, we pay differently, we budget differently, we think about our purpose and our values differently. And what we did is every time we got an answer, we stuck it on the wall. And we stuck it on the wall and stuck it on the wall, and they started to group into these areas, these thematic areas. And we said, well, maybe these are the areas where change has to happen. Maybe these are the areas where interesting things are afoot. And that was basically the V1 of this idea of the operating system. So here's the canvas now, and you've got things like structure and space. How do we team? How do we fit together? How do we think about the hierarchy and the way teams are formed? How do we think about space that we inhabit? So does that mirror the structure that we desire, the collaboration that we desire, the freedom that we desire? Authority and decisions. How do we make decisions? How do we distribute authority or not? Information and communication. What do we share? How do we share it? How often? Who has rights? Who does not have rights to see things? What do we think about transparency? And on. Each of these areas became a question. And there's no judgment in these areas, right? There is no, this is the right way to do authority and decisions, and this is the wrong way, although I have strong opinions. These are just vessels for a conversation to say, how do you work? How do you think about how you come together? How do you think about how you organize? And as you fill this out and think about this, it reveals a culture. It reveals a phenomenon of who the company is at that moment in time. And what we found is that basically the companies that are winning, and I mean that not just financially, but winning in terms of meaning, winning in terms of engagement, winning in terms of social responsibility, in terms of how they connect to the community, have really good answers for each of these areas, and they're very unusual answers. As an example, maybe you take a company like Buurtzorg, right? Based in the Netherlands, 8,000 nurses are able to work at a community level and are empowered to make almost all the decisions they make about how they deliver care, with almost no measurement or top-down enforcement of those metrics, and yet they're able to be competitive and successful versus a more traditional healthcare system. And they're able to do this with a corporate office that only has 50 people in it, against 8,000 in the field. Or you take something like, in the US Navy, a nuclear submarine that went from the lowest performing to the highest performing ship in the entire Navy on the back of a leader deciding, you know what? I'm going to just let my people do what they intend to do, and I'm going to try to steer and create more competency, more transparency, more trust, and more enablement in the system. Very unusual for a system like the US Navy. And of course, this ship now has created more officers in the US Navy than any other ship in the history of the Navy. It's an incredible leadership factory. So there's stories like that. There's stories like Morningstar tomato processing facilities that are in the US, where people are trusted every year to write their own job description and to set their own salary using an advice process. Imagine that, setting your own salary. How would that go at your company? We're in the process of dealing with that in our company, and it's an incredibly sophisticated thing that requires a lot of trust and a lot of maturity. Or at GE, where in their Durham facility they have 300 people under one manager who are creating these engines that have Six Sigma reliability and quality that are able to keep enormous aircraft in the sky, and they're doing it completely on their own, with their own committees, with their own ways of making decisions, with their own ways of collaborating, where they're trusted to do what they need to do, to get the equipment they need to get. There's no kind of oversight going on that tries to, inhibit the behavior of these people. Or Valve, which is a software and gaming company in the Northwest in the US, where the job description has 2 bullet points. Maybe you've heard this before. Bullet point 1 is go find other great people like you. So it's all about recruiting and talent density. And bullet point 2 is your desk has wheels on it. Go find something to do. So imagine having no kind of prescriptive way that people should apply their effort, but actually letting people apply their effort in the way they see fit. And imagine a group of 300 or 400 people generating $4 billion in revenue on the back of a strategy like that. That's what we're talking about. So these are just a few examples. But what's interesting is as you look at these, and there are dozens, if not hundreds of them around the world that we're all excited about, and actually many here in France, you start to ask the question, okay, so fine, let's do it. I'm interested. I want to make the leap. I want to step forward and change my organization, either as someone at the top or as someone in the system that wants to be a change agent. But change is hard, isn't it? Why is it so hard? And in fact, there's this whole kind of mental model in culture, this whole trope about how impossible change is, and how bad people are at change, and how people don't want to change. How many of you have seen this, this comic before, some version of it? Right? Who wants change? Everybody. Who wants to change? Silence. That's the mental model we have for change, is that actually nobody's up for it. And so what we've seen is different kinds of change unfold over the last century. And there's been a whole world of thought leadership and research and academia and practice and consultants thinking about what is the right change model? What is our change management strategy? How are we going to change everything? What is the way that we can drive this from the top that will work? And what's unfathomable to me is that we keep turning the lathe on that. We keep thinking over and over and over again about how to solve that problem. I'll show you a few examples. Some of these may be familiar to you. So here we have the change process. Old status quo, resistance, he doesn't want to go. Chaos, then he's tripping, and then he has a transforming idea. And then he climbs up the tree root, and then integrates, and then a new status quo. Does that look like fun? It looks terrible. It sort of characterizes change as this awful, threatening, chaotic, unbelievably, obtrusive kind of idea that can't be dealt with, right? And the roots of thinking about it this way actually come from a whole wealth of people who are thinking about change as death, who are thinking about change as a kind of a loss of something. And in many ways it is, but it characterizes it in such a way that makes us all afraid to engage with it. Here's another one. This is from Kurt Lewin. So this is the model of we're frozen, we unfreeze, and then we refreeze. Or he just said freeze, but now we say refreeze. And so that's the idea. So obviously with this picture, you know what you need to do now to change your culture of 10,000 people, right? You have to go unfreeze them and then refreeze them. That's helpful. And then, of course, Kurt went on to do some really interesting things that are actually, they're quite helpful for analyzing what's happening. So this is force field analysis, where you can basically look at all the forces that want change. The market's changing faster. We need to move. We need to change things. There's unsustainable costs. We have to change, or our iceberg is melting, as Cotter would say. And then there's the forces against change. Oh, we don't have enough time to change, and the culture doesn't want to change, and clients won't understand it, and it'll cost a lot, right? And the idea was that if you have more pros than cons, it'll happen. But if you have more cons than pros, it won't happen. But of course, mapping that only sort of unlocks for you a kind of high-level understanding of the system. It's not at an individual level. It's not at a team level. It's that we have sort of these macro forces at play. But change obviously happens at all these different levels. It happens at the individual level, the team level, the team of teams level, and the organizational level. So it's hard to make sense with just a tool like this. And then, as I mentioned before, you have things like the Kubler-Ross model that actually come from our study of grief, that come from our study of losing people, where you go through these phases of shock, of denial, of frustration, of depression, of sort of, anger, and then experimentation, decision, integration, right? This is the language of change when it's interpreted through that model. Or another one that I like, this is what I call a Kubler-Ross mashup. So you see all these concepts get picked from and then reinterpreted in massive corporate strategy documents all over the world. So here we go from shock to denial to anger to depression to acceptance and the steady state. But if you have a bridge, you can avoid all that depression. So there's this nice bridge of participate, understand, interact, retain, commit. And if you do that, then everything's going to be fine. So of course, now you're all armed to go do change in your 10,000 person organization. You're just going to build a bridge, right? And so it's all these concepts that are trying to take this vastly complex, rich, human process that is happening at a scale of teams of teams of teams of teams, where people are in different countries, in different geographies, in different cultures, and sort of dumbing it down into a linear framework where we're all in this stage and then we're all in that stage. When the reality is much more interlaced and nuanced and layered and fractal. Another example, William Bridges, also coming from kind of a science of grief, right? So ending, losing, letting go. The neutral zone, when you're kind of like, and then the new beginning, where you decide now you're ready to do this stuff, at a professional level, you're feeling good about it, you're connected to it, your identity is integrated in that new reality. So again, a very simple model, and it's not that these are wrong, right? They're probably true. A lot of these are based on deep research about human nature and the way we show up at work and studies of cultures as they change. But they're not necessarily helpful. They're true but not helpful. If we just try to run a project where we go, all right, we're in the ending, losing, letting go phase, well, that might help give us some instruction. We might try to do some rites of passage and some letting go and some ceremonial kind of conversation. But it doesn't give us a lot of meat to use to make this shift from command and control to freedom and empowerment to to kind of sensing and responding. And then, of course, I would say arguably the most famous change framework. Whenever we say, let's do change, this seems to be the way folks are doing it. This is the Cotter method, right? It was created in the 90s, but then has been, reinformed and adjusted and reused over the last couple decades. And this one is the famous one, right? Create a sense of urgency. We all need to know why we're changing. And then build a coalition and make sure that coalition is bought in. And then have a vision and share that vision. And then create initiatives and have a volunteer army populate those initiatives. And then enable action, right? Get out of the way and remove barriers. And then generate short-term wins. And then sustain that acceleration. And then institute change and kind of make sure that it continues from that point forward. And again, this is sort of true, but it's not true in practice, right? So this is true at a team level or at an experiment level, but it's not true at a global level. So this is happening in one place, but it's not happening in another. Or it's happening with one individual, but it's not happening with another. And so the idea that we can somehow compartmentalize the change process into these units leads us astray. It's challenging. And I have to say from firsthand, evidence, we've done it that way. Like we've gone into companies and said, all right, we're in the urgency part, we're going to understand the problem, and now we're in the coalition part, and we need everyone to pay attention and join and form this coalition. And the reality is that the work just gets in the way. People have things to do. They have other focuses. They have quarters to hit. They have things happen at home. They can't make the meeting where we're forming the coalition, and suddenly they're not in the coalition. So there's all this kind of rich complexity and uncertainty in the day-to-day reality that inhibits thinking this way and inhibits our ability to do this over and over again. ADKAR, another one. We're almost done. By the way, there's so many of these. I could just sit here and show you this for 3 hours. I won't, but I could. And it would just be framework after framework after framework, as if the last one didn't solve the problem and this one will, right? So now we need actually awareness and desire and knowledge and then action and reinforcement. And action and reinforcement is the engagement zone, and the other part is the enablement zone. And now you know how to do change, right? So again, just thinking about this as a phased thing. And again, maybe this is happening at an individual level, but at a systemic level, it's oversimplified. Good friends of ours in Germany have sort of compared and contrasted the old model where you would have an idea that you need to have change, and it's decided at the top. We've committed to it. We've paid some big consultants to come in, and now it's going to happen. And this whole kind of investment cost and resistance and indifference builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up until it fails. Or the alternative is to kind of notice change, communicate it widely, and have a conversation, and have it build up until the resistance peaks before we've committed to do anything. And there's actually an invitation, right, to participate, to actually shape that choice and shape that decision. And then the resistance subsides. And now we're starting to get closer to something that feels realistic, and it feels like it gives us some signal. And then we turn finally to Theory U, right? Theory U from Otto Scharmer and some of his advisors and professors before him. And basically what Theory U says is that there's this journey that we have to go on from downloading and having an awareness of the systems to seeing and perceiving what's really going on, to sensing, to being present in the moment and actually hearing our stuff and confronting what's challenging with us, our ego, our fears, the reasons that we want to reject anything new, all the things that are holding us back, right? And then as that starts to crystallize and we prototype new versions of ourselves and new versions of our teams and organizations, that enables us to perform. And again, that feels pretty realistic. That's what actually happens at an individual level and to a certain extent at a team level. So it starts to inform the process that we might take. Now, what have we learned? So we've gone out over the last many years and tried to do change, tried to do systemic organizational change from an old model, a legacy system where it was top-down and hierarchical and static and fixed and annual plans and annual budgets, and said let's move to a dynamic model that's free and moving and constantly changing, fluid, flexible, freedom, empowerment, transparency. And every time we do that, we're bringing these new practices, these ways of trying change and learning and shifting and shaping what we find. And basically what we found is that there's no way to draw a linear map of what has to happen. It's actually just as complex as the system is, the solution is equally complex, which is not surprising, but in many ways is a revolution. You want to actually have a lot of different interventions and initiatives drop into a system like seeds that are planted, and then watch them grow and watch them run into each other and watch them create patterns of new questions, of insights, of experiences that shape our beliefs. And so what I wanted to share with you today is just new principles for change. And these are beta. These are not, we're not going to say this is a model. It's not a model. I'm not going to show you a visual of the perfect model. I can show you a visual of the pattern that we play out over and over again, but there's no linear pattern that's going to be the right one for you. You're going to have to get in there, get your hands dirty, invite participation, and see what happens. So here are a few principles for change. The first is to move from control to participation. Right? So the idea with change in almost all of these models is that somehow there's someone reading this chart who's saying, all right, I'm going to do change, I have an idea, and I'm going to go implement it. And as a result, there's a desire for control. There's a desire to say, I want people to behave this way, and I want this to happen at this time, and I want us to look like this when we're done. And what we found is that basically that does not allow the system to meet you where it is. Right? There's a gap, there's a delta between the understanding of what one individual wants or a collection of individuals want and what the system wants. And in fact, time after time we've done studies where we ask the leadership team to rank the tensions in the system, and they put them all down and stack rank them and tell us, oh, the number one problem is this and the number two problem is that. And then we ask teams at the edge to rank the problems, and they do a completely different list. They're throwing out cards that the leaders were saying are critically important, and they're choosing a whole different set of things that they'd like to see manifest. And who's right? Who's right in that scenario, right? The reality is that they're both right in a way. Everyone has a perspective. Everyone's sensing tension in the system. And so there's this belief that we have that change comes from a leader, right? So if we look here on the left, we have, in this case, Satya, but it could be any leader. And the leader comes in and we think, great, change is here. Transformation is here. The new leader is here, and they're going to save us from everything. Because they have a vision, or they have an answer, they have an insight. And so we'll just wait for that to be revealed. And look how excited everyone is. So excited to have their company saved. But what it actually looks like in practice is what's happening on the right. Teams, in a room, engaged, trying things, experimenting, communicating, taking space, frankly, having time and space to just reflect on how they work. I can't tell you how many teams we go in and we just ask, what percentage of your time do you spend retrospecting and thinking about how you work and how it's working for you? And the answer is usually somewhere between 0 and 5%. 0 and 5% of our time spent thinking, how did that go? What about the way we did that would we change? What about the way we did that would we keep the same? And so that muscle of reflecting, retrospecting, putting change into process is what it actually looks like. So honestly, half of what we do that seems to work is simply about protecting time. It's simply about holding space and saying, we were brought in to protect you from all the nonsense that's going on so you can have 5 minutes as a team to think and decide what you might want to do differently. And that's enough to get the ball rolling. Another example here, another principle is planning to experiencing. And I think this is one that we've come to more recently that we're really, really excited about. The idea here is that we can sit here and plan and think and read and discuss and debate the merits of different ways of working. I can tell you, there's this new meeting type that you're going to love, or you really have to try Slack, it's the best thing, or you really should dump PowerPoint, don't use slides anymore, or I could tell you, what you have to do is have an offsite once a year where you fly everybody in. I can tell you any of that stuff, but until you do it, you don't know if it's for you, and until you do it, you don't know what it feels like. So one of the techniques that we use most often, and I think you'll actually hear about this tomorrow from Brian, is a check-in round. It's a practice that we picked up from Holacracy. So at the beginning of almost every meeting we have, we just check in. Everybody at the table has a chance to just say what's got their attention right now. Or sometimes we'll ask a funny check-in question like, what superpower would you like to have? Or maybe we'll ask a tough question like, what are you afraid of? Just a question, just to hear everyone's voice and check in. And when I say that out loud to teams and to leaders and CEOs, they say, yeah, that's cute, but that's not going to fix our problems. But what's reality is when you actually do a check-in round and then you just stop afterward and say, let's notice the energy in the room. Let's notice the dynamic. It's totally different. It's electric. Everybody's present. Everybody listened. Everybody knows something about someone else. There's context. There's energy. And I guarantee if all you did was go back to your office and just do that at scale, you'd have a 10% improvement in performance next year. Just from that. But the idea is you haven't experienced it, so you think I'm full of shit. So the idea is how do we actually create those experiences? And I've actually learned this very sort of hands-on with my son. So on the right, you see my son riding his balance bike. And a balance bike is new since I was a kid. When I was a kid, you had, training wheels, right? Balance bike says no training wheels because training wheels doesn't teach you what it feels like to be on a bike, to balance a bike. All it's teaching you to do is pedal. And pedaling's easy. Everybody knows how to pedal. That's not the hard part. The hard part is the balance. So if we give kids the bike with no pedals, and they can move their feet and lift their feet and move their feet and lift their feet, they sense the energy of what it is to ride a bike. They know what it feels like to ride a bike. And I've watched him. He's 4.5. He's learned to ride this bike. He can zip down the street with his feet up, no problem. He's fully 2 years younger than I was when I learned how to ride a bike. And in my case, I actually had to saw my training wheels off. I was caught by my mother in the garage with a saw going to town on him because I wanted that freedom, and I couldn't get it. So this person thinks they can ride. They can't. The other person knows what it feels like. And the same thing goes for all these new ways of working, all these new ways of relating and deciding and collaborating. It might sound like we can evaluate them and judge them without doing them, but we can't. You don't know what it's like to run a company without a budget until you run a company without a budget. You don't know what it's like to have completely transparent compensation where everyone can see what everyone makes until you do it. And once you do it, you can sense the power and the promise, the challenges and the realities of what it is to have it. So we want to default in our transformation projects to letting people do stuff. We say start by starting. So we're just going to do stuff. We're not going to talk about it and debate it and argue it to death. We're going to say, we have attention, we think we have too many meetings, we have a solution, we're going to do it. Let's try it. And we can always stop. We can stop in a week if we don't like it. The third is big changes to small changes. And this speaks to the heart of what transformation is trying to do. So transformation says we need a big change because otherwise we're going to be out of business. We got to go digital. We have to become responsive. We have to become more global, whatever the nature of the change is. And so we need a big move. We need big adjustments. And it's going to require lots of org charts, lots of consultants, lots of money, lots of time. And the reality is that it's really, really hard to make big things happen. So even if you have a big idea, you can't get the system to respond. So you can have a big idea and yell at 300,000 people that you want them to do it, but it's not going to work. They're not going to do it for you because there's so much inertia and momentum and connection to the current way of working that it hasn't become personal. It hasn't become practical for everybody just to hear about it or to get the email. And in fact, we know that the vast majority of transformations don't work in the first place, right? So we're talking about, without participation, as we talked about before, only 3% are said to work. And interestingly, when you ask CEOs versus line workers, CEOs will rate things having worked about 28% of the time, and line workers about 6%. So there's a huge delta between the two. So again, yeah, you can try to do big stuff, but it'll be impossible to move. The boulder's too big. But the smaller moves actually unlock a whole bunch of different possibilities. Because now, when we do the small move, we get to sense what's possible. So there's a kind of an advantage in terms of the emotions. We've tried something, we felt it, we now feel a little bit more confident, we feel a little bit more safe. The system has held us in this uncertainty. Other people have noticed, we've learned something, and now we want to have another bite at the apple. And it's practical. We've gotten some advantage. Something's better. We're faster, or we're leaner, or we're simpler, or we're better connected and interrelated. Some advantage has happened. And what's cool is when you do these small changes and you spread them out, people start to notice, and then they want some. Because as we talked about before, engagement's at a consistent low. People are not especially happy at work. And so when they see a team that is happy, they want what they're having. And there's sort of this focus in on, wow, it seems like that's working really well. Can we do that too? And so you get a lot more opt-in behavior because you've spread these small experiments out instead of having one big grand pronouncement try to happen to everybody else at the same time. So there's a real value to that kind of small move thing. And for those of you that practice agile or lean methodology, it's also just more practical from a process and production standpoint, right? It's much easier to figure out what's going on with a small bite. It's much easier to implement. It's much easier to diagnose. It's much easier to capture and learn from than to try to do something that's a grand pronouncement. For that reason, we limit the size of our teams. So when we have teams embedded, they're 2 or 3 people, and we don't let teams of more than 7 to 10 work on this kind of stuff in any context. Because it's just too many people, and it'll result in big choices and big moves and decisions that will interrupt progress at best. Adding to subtracting. So we're really good, and anyone who can sort of open their garage or their closet or their cupboard knows this. We're really good at adding stuff. You get more stuff, and then you get a little bit more stuff, and a little bit more stuff. We're terrible at getting rid of stuff. Saying no, reducing, taking away the complexity. And we have this concept we often talk about called organizational debt. So just like technical debt exists for organizations that are writing software and they haven't refactored it, there's a kind of organizational debt where we built a policy, but we don't really need it anymore, but we keep it. And we have a structure and a role that we don't really need anymore, but we keep it. And we add people, and we add functions, and we add. And now there's all this debt that we haven't refactored, and it basically slows us down and kills us. It becomes this, this thing that we can no longer respirate through. We can no longer breathe through all that organizational debt. And so one of the interesting things about the change process that we're learning is that sometimes, and often in the beginning, the easiest thing to do to create momentum is actually to go in and do the experiment of taking something away. Take something away instead of add something. So I'll give you an example. We had a client in the education space who had in their leadership team, across roughly 20 leaders, an average of 45 hours a week of meetings. So just imagine that for a second. 45 hours a week of meetings. Here's a calendar example. 45 hours a week of meetings, and some of the tensions we were hearing in the system were, we don't have time for vision. We didn't have time to think. Well, yeah, of course you don't. There's 45 hours of meetings lined up, and the reason was everybody wanted to have a meeting with everybody else, but not together. Let's all have them one-on-one, and let's all have team-to-team, and let's all try to, silo this communication. And instead of, sharing it in an open forum, let's do it in these private conversations, right? And so that was the challenge. Now, you could go into that group and say, let's fix all your meetings. But that's overwhelming, right? Now you're adding something on top of my 45-hour-a-week problem. And so what we did instead is we said, hey, how dangerous would it be? Would it be safe to try if we took all the meetings off the calendar for 2 weeks? Just see what happens, right? We're just going to take everything down, and we're going to see where it hurts. And they thought about it, and everybody said, yeah, let's do it. So we did. Wipe the calendar clean, and there's a sort of refreshment that comes from just having a blank piece of paper. One of the things that we hear most often from older, more legacy businesses when we talk about the operating systems at companies like Valve or Google or what have you is, well, they had the benefit of a white sheet of paper. They got to start their business fresh. And they don't have all this debt that we have, all this structure, all these demands, the shareholders, et cetera. And that's true. There are some things that you can't refactor, but my gosh, there's a lot that you can. So you take away first and then refill what's needed. So we did the 2-week moratorium on meetings, and then we said, all right, what were we missing? Oh, well, we need a way to coordinate, weekly. So let's do kind of a brief stand-up. Okay, great. What else are we missing? Oh, we need, a meeting where we can get advice and do some decisioning. All right, let's add one of those. By the time we were done, we'd probably freed up 25, 35 hours a week of time, and we had a fully baked algorithm that was successfully achieving what it needed to achieve, that was using the time appropriately, right? So start by taking away. Take it away and see if you miss it. You may not. And in fact, one of the best things you can do to help empower people is get out of their way. That's the big idea here. And lastly, but not least, resistance to information. So one of the things that we started with was that image of change. Who wants to change? Everybody. Who wants to change themselves? Nobody. Nobody raises their hand. There's this feeling that somehow resistance is the natural human instinct, and that resistance is a kind of a backwards response to change, right? Why is everyone being so stupid? Don't they see that digital is coming and it's going to eat us? Don't they see that Amazon is buying Whole Foods? Don't they see that we have to do this? Or don't they see that everybody's demoralized because we're all telling them what to do? Yeah, they probably see that. But there's something about the way you're doing change. There's something about the way that people have been invited. There's something about their situation, their incentives, how they think of themselves, their ego. There's something that's in the way of that happening. And the reality is, it's not really their fault. It's kind of your fault if you're the change agent, if you're the one designing the system. And so we have to make this mental model leap from resistance as bad to resistance as information. And it's very much the same thing that product developers have had to do and product owners have had to do when they look at customer feedback. Customer feedback to a Valley-based startup is lifeblood. It's manna from heaven, right? They're telling you what they need and what they want and how they need to get it. And if somebody quits, they're always reaching out to find out why and how can they get them back. And they're turning that feedback into an iterative, continuous improvement strategy. And then you get to change, and somebody stonewalls you or doesn't show up to the meeting or says they don't agree, and most people go, forget that guy. He doesn't get it. He's not hip to it. He'll have to go, right? But as we've talked about, today and in the past couple of years, it's not a people problem, right? Theory X, theory Y, people are generally good. They're generally acting in their own self-interest. They're generally thinking intelligently about what's going on. And so we have to assume the best, and we have to treat them as customers in the change process. And that means using it as information and finding out what would change this for you. What would allow this? And sometimes just participation is enough. If it's not happening to them but through them, that's enough. And sometimes transparency is enough. And sometimes experiencing is enough. And so we actually see how all these principles come together to unlock. But even if those are not enough, we want to engage on that idea of give me your resistance. Give me the things that are holding back the behavior that we want to see, and let's turn it into information. Let's turn it into signal for the change. What is wrong with them? Not so much. What are they telling us? What are they telling us about what we need to do next and how we can help and get out of the way, frankly? So here's what it looks like in practice. And I want to warn you, this is not a linear framework. This is a loop. This is a thing that we do over and over and over again in lots of little places until an emergent change unfolds, until the system takes the bait. In complexity science, they call it irritating the system. We're going to irritate the system with this loop until it starts to respond, and its antibodies show up, and we see what it tells us about how the change is going to unfold. So we start with insights. What's wrong? My favorite question to ask teams, what's holding you back from doing the best work of your life? Full stop. What's holding you back from doing the best work of your life? What's slowing you down? That's a signal. That's an insight. Oh, that process, that toll gate, that leader, that budgeting thing, that decision process, that lack of resources, whatever it is. Turn that into options, And this is something that Jason Little has done an amazing job with lean change management talking about. Generate options. Doesn't have to be one thing. Here are the options. Here are all the ways that we can bring this to life. We could do this, we could do that, we could do a small, medium, and large. We discuss those options with the system through participation, through transparent discussion. And then let's test and learn. So let's try something. Let's go break a couple eggs. Let's make an omelet. Let's do it and learn. And then we turn that back into insights. So it worked. Let's scale it. It didn't work. Let's try another option. And we do this over and over, and we invite teams to do it. Because the goal is not to be done. And I think this is as true in organizational change as it is in any other kind of form of Kaizen or growth. You're never done. And the idea is actually for the system to finally take accountability for the first time in 100 years for its own way of working and organizing. For the system to start to pay attention to the way it works and do what we call continuous participatory change. Continuous, meaning it's always going on. It's a muscle that we have built. Participatory, meaning it's open to everyone. Everybody is governing their own working style, their own team, their own environment, their own way. And it's change. We're listening, we're sensing, we're responding to the world around us. Continuous participatory change. And it has some cool phenomenon that unfold as a result. Emotionally, every time we turn the loop, the experiments increase the confidence and the safety and the ambition. That is if the leaders and the system holds the space and keeps people safe. You've heard about psychological safety, that's critical. But if that's there, every turn of the loop increases that emotional resonance. Practically it helps because it relieves tension and increases performance. So every time we do an experiment, the system goes, awesome, we're faster, we're more connected, we're more informed, something is going better than it was before. And systemically, experiments generate these kind of new questions, these new bigger ideas. So at the end of a whole year of working with a team where we were focused on decision rights and we were focused on role clarity and we were focused on eliminating that meeting overload, et cetera, somebody goes, hey, why do we do budgets annually? And it was like, ding, there's the next big question. And we lead ourselves as these questions unfold, these negative spaces open up, and we can fill them with a new experiment, with a new way of solving that problem. And we can look to the field of other innovators that are out there and learn and change as we grow and become this future of work, this community, this way of showing up that we all know that we want to realize in the world. And if we don't realize it, we run the risk of fading into obscurity. So this is the loop. These are the principles. And the reality is that no chart that I can put up here is going to sum up change for you. It is messy, it is human, it is frustrating at times, it is exhilarating at times. But if you consistently focus on participation, on connection, on experiencing what's happening, on holding people in a safe space for that experimentation, then everything is dramatically, dramatically easier. And you can see the fruits of your labor in a reasonable amount of time. And it's very, very exciting. So with that, I will say thank you.